Well, Minnie, I'm super excited to have this conversation with you. Also, just connecting with you in general.
I know it's overdue.
I know it really is. Also, us APIs, we got to stick together. So, I'm really excited to have this discussion as a leader in the reproductive freedom sphere and also just a leader in the AAPI. You're a trailblazer for AAPIs. This is going to be a
That makes me sound and feel old.
no, this is a good thing. We need
Okay.
people we need people like you to talk more about this and like talk more about how the intersections between repro and the AAPI activist movements
Yeah. Yeah.
happen. So this is going to be a really important conversation. And also I think it will inspire young activists like myself and other people to have these conversations with their families, their relatives, their community members. So I think this will be a really important conversation, and also just to get to know more about you and if your background has shaped your career choices and your like your entire public policy like resume. So I'm really excited. So we can just get started. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's get into it.
Awesome. Okay. So being the first Indian American president of the oldest reproductive freedom organization in the country, you have emerged as an important figure of AANHPI leadership in a movement where efforts of Black women and other women of color have traditionally been erased from the larger narrative. How has your experience as a woman of color, and specifically an AANHPI woman, shaped your pursuit of a career in public policy?
It's such a good question. Thanks for asking. And, I could ask the same question back to you as a young South Asian American woman. Your background is immigrant as well. Is your,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
First generation, second generation?
First gen.
Yeah, and me too. We used to call it one and a half.
Yeah.
Because I was born in India, but we came here when I was an infant.
I mean,
So
I think first gen is being born here, right?
right, right.
Right. So I was born in New York, but my parents were born in Punjab. So yeah,
Yeah. So your parents were the first to come to this country.
first come.
So
Mm-hmm.
you had a cultural experience of being raised in this country with in a family that maybe spoke a different language, had different cultural, linguistic, culinary, differences, and then going to school every day in a mixed race culture environment. So, for me, my parents came here in the early 70s. My mom actually went back to India to have me because she didn't want to have a baby by herself, in a country without her sisters and her mother, which is a very, culturally big thing to have an extended family helping you take care of your kids. So, for her, that was a big deal. And then they came back. So the family joke is that's why I can't be president, because she reverse anchor babied me. Like I'm not, they were always like, we're going to go back to India and you'll be an Indian citizen. And I'm like, well, that doesn't matter because we never,
Yeah,
you guys messed it up. Most immigrants do the opposite. What?
exactly.
But in all seriousness, it underscores the deep ties my parents had to India. We went back almost every summer of my childhood till I was 18. And I have very close relationships with all of my family. Most of them have immigrated here now. And a lot of them my cousins have kids your age, who grew up here. And I was the American auntie who they could relate to about things like dating, going to the prom, like all these things that, their parents were like, what's that? Like, what do you mean you have a boyfriend? Or a girlfriend?
Yeah.
So it's been, but that ties into the work we do, right? Because, one of the challenges for our community is cultural stigma, and not just the conflict of cultures, right? We come from countries that are by and large socially conservative, maybe politically liberal, but socially conservative. So
Mm-hmm.
some of these
Mm-hmm.
issues come to clash for us when we're raised in this country. But you asked about my career. In my parents' family, back home in India, they were very political. Both sets of my grandparents, it's a very common story. Both sets of my grandparents were active, in the revolution,
Right.
to say, the revolution sounds like in America, it sounds like, what are you talking about? The 1800s, or the 1700s.
Yeah.
But in India, that means in the 1930s and 40s.
Mm-hmm.
My
Mm-hmm.
dad was born in the 30s. My mom was born in the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
This is pre-independence India for folks who are
Yep.
watching. India wasn't an independent country. It was still a British
Exactly.
colony.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a big history of political activism in our family. Both of my grandfathers were super politically engaged. And it was sort of a cultural thing that was passed down. I have an uncle who was a labor union leader. I have an uncle who was a publisher of a newspaper. I have
Mm-hmm.
several. I have an aunt who was a feminist writer and ran a feminist press. Um, all of these relatives are now deceased, but they had really activist careers, and they were really committed to the social good. So I grew up, even though I was an immigrant here, and my mom was worked part-time in childhood education, and my father was an engineer. I was exposed every summer to these really dynamic people who were doing really important political work, and it made me
Right.
feel like I could do anything, and that I had a role and a voice in all of this too.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point too. Like, I think India in general and like Indians also have that sense of political activism, just given the
We're such a young
history.
democracy. We can all,
Exactly.
whether it's the partition, whether it's
Hmm.
from Pakistan and India and the border who had the partition shape their lives, whether it's, having family members in the fight for the largest democracy in the world. It's very fresh. It's
It's
very fresh
super
for us.
fresh. It's so fresh. And you see AAPIs, well, you see Indian Americans in leadership roles in political and like in the political spheres, in the social spheres. So like it
Yeah,
really
way more
is
than we
kind of
used to.
it's
In
in us, you know?
administration,
Yeah.
I mean, for better or for worse, Nikki Haley is a member of your community. Our
Yeah.
community, specifically Sikh American. I don't know how many people
She
have Nikki Haley.
we know
Amrita,
we don't talk about her, but like she is.
Amrita, or I'm having a complete brain blank on Bobby Jindal's real name. But anyway,
Oh yeah. Bobby
both
Jindal. What a
aren't they
throwback.
both, aren't they both Punjabi? They're
They're
both
both
Punjabi. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Well, the
yeah.
Punjabi community is very political.
Yeah.
So it's a very activist community as well. So yeah. And then even in like, Vietnamese communities, there's a lot of refugee activists, the
Hmm.
American community, it's a similar story. They can trace back just a few generations from major cultural,
Yeah.
revolution, changes in their region and their countries. So a
Right.
lot of us, either we were political refugees or we came for economic opportunity, but we're all from countries that have gone through a lot of political
Right.
upheaval recently.
Exactly. And that's like the main thing, right? This is so recent, so fresh for us. And like, with like the influx of social media, it's just made us even more powerful and even more stronger to be
Bobby Jindal's
representatives.
name is Piyush. That's what it is.
Oh
Piyush.
my God, yes, that's it. That's it. What a throwback. Bobby Jindal, what a throwback. But yeah, no, that is wonderful and how your family has actually shaped
Oh yeah.
your
Well, and I always talk about my mom. She was the first feminist I ever knew.
right.
She was unabashedly so. She used to talk to me about Barbara Jordan. What was one of the first things when she moved to this country? She was watching the Watergate hearings, and she
Right.
was just fascinated by Barbara Jordan and like how powerful she was as a
Right.
Black woman
Hmm.
holding the president of the United States accountable. She was like, "This is
Hmm.
incredible. This is an incredible country. These amazing things are happening, and women of color." Even though she may not have had the lexicon for that at the time, she was like, these women who are clearly not white are like running this country and having
Yeah.
an outsized impact, and it's inspiring, and it was the kind of thing she wanted me to know and understand growing up.
And I think that leads into our second question really well, especially the fact that you talked about that we might not have like the actual vernacular in our language to actually express ourselves. So our next question is AANHPIs across the country have always faced unique barriers to care. Our partners at NAPOF pointed out that AANHPIs struggle with linguistic barriers, right? Concerning healthcare, risk of criminalization for abortion due to racial profiling, risk of immigration consequences if criminalized for an abortion, and many, many more. Additionally, from my own experience, ANHPIs continue to grapple with social and cultural stigma around reproductive health. So, how has the recent reversal of Roe actually worsened these difficulties, or have they added newer challenges to the mix?
So our friends at NAPOF do a really good job of breaking this down, and We're going to have more conversations with them soon. And I'm really excited that I just joined their board. So it was important for me because, you know, in my career, I've done a lot of API roles with API orgs or API electeds. And here in this role, even though I am AANHPI, I don't get to necessarily be in that space as much as I'd like. So it was exciting for me to be able to join Sung Yan and the really amazing team over there. So what I'll say is, you nailed a lot of it already. You summarized it. But I think you need to remember what folks need to understand who aren't from our communities is anytime you have a crisis where a community's been marginalized, that crisis gets compounded. Right. But NARAL, we talk a ton about how Dobbs has affected access to care, how it's making maternal mortality and morbidity issues more extreme. It's heightening where people already had access challenges. It's making it worse. So if you have a community that has a combination of cultural stigma, limited English proficiency, already like limited access to the healthcare system, and then you take away the legal right to abortion, or you place an abortion ban in states where we are some of the fastest growing populations. Like, I don't know how many people understand that APIs are the fastest growing population in Georgia, which has a abortion ban. Asian Americans are growing rapidly in my home state of Texas, which also has a terrible ban on the books. It has multiple bans, including SB 8, which is a vigilante bill. And anytime you have those layers of barriers, it makes it harder and worse. I think the other piece of it is, you know, the abortion access. Abortion access was already really challenging for AAPIs for a variety of reasons. One, limited access to clinics, right? Limited access to information, limited access to how to self-manage your own care. Then the cultural stigma it's interesting because in the countries that we're from and in a lot of our cultures, abortion access isn't necessarily a religious problem. Married and you have children and you decide you need an abortion for whatever reason. In many of our home countries, like India and especially China, there was state funded abortion access, right? For reasons of, you know, public policy in those states regarding population. Misguided and sometimes abused, right? In India, very much abused in the 70s. Folks who are from there will remember the Indira Gandhi National Emergency, where they forced sterilization on rural women. Horrifying. In China, the one-child policy, you know, created a lot of really problematic reproductive the other side of reproductive rights infringement. So when I'm talking to API leaders who are of the first generation to immigrate to this country, since Dobbs, one of the conversations that's been really resonating, and it's been brought up to me, not me to them, has been, you know, we come from countries where our reproductive freedom was taken away from us in a different way.
Right.
Authentically to what happens when you allow the government to make decisions. So, and not, you don't have bodily autonomy. So it's less about abortion and the cultural or religious connotation of abortion or stigma around abortion. It's more about letting the government control your body. That's one of the reasons we left.
Right.
Or that's one of the things we appreciated when we immigrated here. So they can tell a really compelling story about what happens when you let the government have too much overreach.
Right.
Population control, bodily autonomy, all the ways that can go wrong. So that's interesting because when I first started working in reproductive rights and I went home and I told my family in India what I was doing, they were super confused.
Right.
They were like, why do you need a lobby for abortion funding in Texas? Here in India, it's paid for by the government.
Right.
You know? And they really couldn't understand it. But then I had to explain it's the whole Judeo-Christian sort of, actually, I shouldn't say Judeo, the whole extremist Christian ideology in this country, white supremacy, all of that, which wasn't totally hard for them to understand because they've experienced the British Raj and the British colonization of India and the imposition of some of those things. So when you come back to the United States and you talk to AAPI, NHPI communities, it's a really complicated conversation because in our communities, we don't often talk about sex before marriage. We don't talk about sex outside of the context of marriage, but we're comfortable talking about abortion in the context of family planning.
Exactly.
So it's really confounding. What I will say is, prior to Dobbs, we had a really significant believability gap with the American population, including AAPIs and NHPIs. And I say NH because I'm talking about the Native Hawaiian population. People thought, well, Roe is the law of the land. I don't have a lot of us are in states where we have unfettered access. It's not a problem for us.
Right.
Post Dobbs, everyone knows someone who has a complication. Everyone knows somebody who had a challenge. And it's made it very visceral and real, including for AAPIs. But the truth is, this is a very long-winded answer, but the truth is, prior to Dobbs, there were Asian American women in this country who were really stigmatized and caught up in legal challenges. You know, we talk about the case of Purvi Patel in Indiana. It was like a decade ago that she was prosecuted for a miscarriage. And then we talk about the case in Ireland that rocked the country and made abortion legal, which is Savita Halpanar, who was a dentist from India who lived in Ireland and had a very complicated, dangerous pregnancy. She could not have an abortion and she died. Her death catalyzed a movement in Ireland. So when I talk to Indian Americans specifically, I like to talk about Purvi Patel and Savita Halpanar because folks don't want to think about us in the It's much more visceral. Like, we all know a Savita, we all know a Purvi. And then you begin to realize how quickly our communities can get caught in these traps.
And you know what? I think you also brought up a good point. The difference between how India government plays and how we think socially, right? So like when immigrants from India move here, right, they get more entrenched in their more cultural values because they want to hold on to something. They want to hold on to their roots,
right? They become ultra Indians.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what happens. That's really what happens. It's like
when I go back to India, my cousins would be like, you know more about like you're like more desi than we are, okay? Like we're like drinking Diet Coke and we're like eating at McDonald's, and you're like your parents are, you know, giving you like culturally specific foods and clothes.
No, that is so true. Like when I talk to my cousins, right? I sometimes think that my cousins in India are just like way more like American than I am because they are exposed to different things, but like also
we're culturally where our parents were when they left for me 50 years ago.
No, literally that. And that's because we want to hold on to some type of root, right?
But it's becoming more progressive and it's becoming more socially acceptable to talk about sex outside of the context of marriage in India.
Yeah.
Not for our families, but it changes the more immigrants come.
Exactly. And I think that like, you know, that dissonance is really, really telling. And it's just like, it's a unique thing that I think happens with a lot of immigrant communities. It's not only specific to Indian Americans or even AAPIs. It's just that we're trying to hold on to a root, but like, okay, is it actually making sense in the context and the place we're living, or is it making sense societally too? So I think that is.
And what I would say to, you know, my cousins who've got kids growing up in this country, I mean, I have kids growing up in this country, but mine are really little. And my husband's I was about to say American. See, that's a cultural problem. My husband is white and my kid is Black. So my cultural dynamics in my family are very different, but in my immediate family, but what I tell a lot of, you know, first gen Indian American, and we're talking, I think you and I, about Indian Americans because we're both from that community.
Yeah.
But I think some of this applies to the broader immigrant community, is your kids are growing up here. You put your head in the sand and think you can contain culture and you can contain values in your house. You're making a critical mistake. Your kids are spending more time at school and in social media and outside of your house than they ever will spend in your house. And if you're not in tune with that, you will lose like the ability to nurture and, you know, support them in their journey emotionally, sexually, professionally, with their social circles. And it's a challenge for our kids because there's other cultural issues around like bullying, you know, other social stigma, fitting in. And when you put those insecurities and those challenges in our communities, you know, you get kids who can be taken advantage of, or who just don't have the medical, they don't have the information. Do you want your kids learning about sex? from total strangers, or do you want them learning it out from you?
Yeah.
No matter
Yeah.
how hard it is to talk about.
Yeah. Honestly, I wish you were able to tell my parents that. So
Well, maybe I'll tell somebody's parents that through this channel that we're talking about. I
no,
mean, I
absolutely.
think on a side note, we should dig into this, and maybe it's happening, and we should ask our friends at NAPOF. Like,
Mhm.
there's a need for comprehensive sex ed that's culturally competent in our communities.
Yes.
There's a
Yes.
lot of important, really groundbreaking work on sex ed across the country, but I would really love to understand and lift up the culturally competent sex ed for APIs
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
it's a huge gap.
There's a huge gap, and that leads really well into our next question. So, and we've talked about this, we touched about on this a little bit, but personally, I've experienced that sometimes in the API community, especially our elders. So like we've actually did talk about this. Don't fully understand the fight for abortion rights,
Right.
why it's so important, or even how it applies to them. Even like the mere mention of just bringing this topic up in conversation leads to like dismissive gestures, eye rolls, or like head shakes, or some type of like some avoidance, right? So I'm curious if you've witnessed something similar, and if so, how have you communicated the importance of this fight for repro freedom for folks within our community?
I think it's about how you frame it,
Right.
right? And it's unfortunate that you're still seeing eye rolls and head shakes. I think some of that is just there's still a little bit of that model minority thing happening in our
Mm-hmm.
community where some of our elders are like, well, we're in this country, your job is to do better than I did,
Right.
right? Which means not necessarily getting involved in political fights, but maybe pursuing a different professional path. In my
Mm-hmm.
family, that was less of a challenge, even though my father did try to get me to become an engineer. I just wasn't good enough in math, so I was able to weasel my way out of that one. Uh, but I will say I'm very proud of. I've got some young cousins who, in fact, one who just graduated who just finished her residency and is now officially a doctor, and they're
Mm-hmm.
they're learning about abortion care and they want to talk about it, and
Right.
they're picking residencies in places where they can get access to education on abortion. So that's
Mm-hmm.
I'm very proud of them. But to your question, I think it's about how you frame it. Like if you
Right.
talk about it as a bodily autonomy issue, you might still get an eye roll. But then if you
Mm-hmm.
say, no, wait, let's talk about this. Like, how would you feel if your daughter or your granddaughter was not able to make a choice to save my life? Or
Right.
was not allowed to make a choice to protect my family. We
Mm-hmm.
know most people who have abortions already have children. And there's a
Right.
variety of reasons why they may
Mm-hmm.
choose to have an abortion. But it's not as simple as you think. And again, in our community, the cultural stigma for actual abortion is less. So
Mm-hmm.
into, the larger ecosystem of why someone might need to make a choice about when, and how to have a family. And they shouldn't have that choice taken away from them. That really does resonate in our community. People
Yeah.
really do want that bodily autonomy and control over their family planning. That is
Right.
really important to them.
Yeah.
And then politically, the majority of Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians are politically progressive.
Mm-hmm.
I think the latest numbers are something like over 65% vote
Mm-hmm.
with the Democratic Party. So when you talk about it as a way to weaponize attacks on our fundamental freedoms and democracy, especially democracy, our communities care deeply about democracy. So when you
Yeah.
talk about I'm in this movement because it's one piece of a larger fight for preserving our democracy, I found very few of our elders don't get that.
Right.
Watch
Mm-hmm.
what's happening. And that's kind of what I mean about this post-Dobbs believability. They might have been
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, you're overreacting. It's not that big a deal pre-Dobbs. Now everyone is seeing it. And they're seeing the connection between the erosion of bodily autonomy and reproductive rights and access to abortion and the fundamentals of our ability to function in a democratic society.
Right.
And our communities understand that. And I think they, given the chance, can be really compelled to be activists around that. Last thing I'll say, and it is a little model minority leaning, but it's been helpful and I've seen it. When I was in Texas a lot last year, visiting family, but also doing some campaign work for Beto O'Rourke, I met several Indian American and South Asian American doctors who
Mm-hmm.
personally were able to tell really terrifying stories about how
Right.
they felt threatened, how they felt attacked, and how they could not give medically accurate and competent care to their patients. I
Mm-hmm.
met a young Indian American woman, physician in Dallas who was an oncologist. She was
Mm-hmm.
like, I can't, and we know cancer treatment, chemotherapy is dangerous for a fetus. So if you have a cancer patient who gets pregnant, you need to be able to counsel them about their options.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Abortion, it could be life-saving for them. And
Mm-hmm.
she was like, I can't in good faith practice here anymore because I had a pregnant patient I could not talk to about her choices.
Mm-hmm.
Am I
Mm-hmm.
committing her to a death sentence?
Right, right, right.
She's like, it's not right.
Mm-hmm.
So I do find those voices are very compelling to our elders too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I also think like our communities are so rooted in our faith. Having faith-based conversations, I think also always help because in for the Indian American community or just Indians in general, faith also clashes with culture very, very often and very regularly. So having these types of conversations based in faith and with a cultural tilt will I think also help like shape a narrative and make our elders understand and even people who are just not exposed to this movement understand more
And I
that
think
this affects us.
it's such a good point. And I will say, and maybe this is something you and I can do something about.
Yeah.
That in a lot of the faith-based conversations about reproductive rights, our voices are not there.
Right, right.
Sometimes they'll include a Muslim, imam
Mm-hmm.
or faith leader, but you don't often see Buddhist or Sikh or Hindu voices.
Mm-hmm.
And we know our faiths are quite flexible and
Very
progressive
flexible.
when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to this, much like Judaism,
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
it's the life of the pregnant person that is actually held to a higher standard of protection, right? And
Yeah.
and it was one of the first questions I asked my mom when I started getting involved, in my family, like in a lot of our families. My mother's my, spiritual leader, my faith leader. We practice mostly in our home.
Yeah.
Um, she was like, no, it's not a conflict.
Exactly.
Talk about that.
Exactly.
Right.
No, that is so true. Like, when I had this conversation with my parents, when I first joined NARAL, I was like, I want to be part of this movement. My parents were just like super, super supportive about it. And I was watching this video actually about a sick couple who was getting an abortion. And they related it to how Sikhi actually helped them and like kind of like, justified their actions. And it just like this was what was meant to be and this was how our life is going to go ahead and Sikhi helped us make that decision and I think more of these types of conversations need to happen because we're so faith-based. Indian Americans are faith-based. Indians are so like I agree and I think that's something me and you can definitely collaborate on because we like especially
Yeah.
our faiths have
Yeah.
flexibility in this sphere.
And even if, even our friends at like Catholics for Choice, where maybe certain, Catholic leaders or folks who are very doctrinal think that their faith is opposed to abortion access, but the majority of Catholic Americans are not.
Right.
They believe in birth control and they believe in the right to have the government out of your decision making.
Right.
So
Right.
even when we have certain communities within our broader community with certain denominations or certain faith interpretations that are more conservative, they still have the right to have access. But there
Exactly.
is a really great opportunity for us to educate a broader range of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, because our faith traditions are so diverse.
So diverse and also so strong.
So,
Um,
right. So culturally deep. Sometimes it's not even faith, it's just the way of life.
yeah, yeah.
Deeper than faith. It's like it affects every single, it's not like a separate thing we do once a week. It's like in everything we do.
It's in every decision we make.
That's
And
right.
I can say that for myself too. Like I consider myself a devout Sikh. So, and most of the decisions I make, I think of a Sikhi as my identity. So my decisions are reflective of my identity. So that I think and that is very, I think, accurate to a lot of people who are faith-based and who are religious. So every move they make is their identity and and something as big as having an abortion
Or
can also
how you have a family.
exactly, exactly. And it's really important. We can jump to our next question. And you mentioned Georgia, so this is a good jumping off point. In Georgia alone, the percentage of eligible AANHPI voters who participated in the November midterm elections drastically increased from 2018 to 2022, making it the highest jump of any demographic group in this cycle. Data also shows that Asian Americans have some of the highest levels of support for abortion rights, which you also mentioned. So it's clear that reproductive freedom is and was a critical factor for AANHPI voters in the midterms. So how do you think this voting bloc will play a role in shaping abortion laws and the abortion narrative in the future, and also leading up to 2024?
Yeah, another additional fact that from our friends at NAPOF is 35% of the pregnancies in our community end in abortion. So when you look at a state like Georgia, and the fact that not only did they ban abortion at 6 weeks, which is before most people know they're pregnant,
right?
The abortion access crisis is affecting access to just regular OB-GYN services, right? Hospitals are shutting down. Like, it's devastating what's happening in Georgia. And folks are like, I want to live in Georgia because I have economic opportunity. Many folks in our community are entrepreneurs, so they go to a place like Georgia so they can start businesses. They want to be able to hire people there. They want to attract talent there. And in our community, they're realizing how challenging that is. You know, API and NHPI voters, not many places in the country, we're the margin makers, we're the majority makers. You know, we're the voters who are going to take you over the top. Right. You know, 50-50 district, we're going to be that 1% to get you to 51. And a lot, as someone who's been an activist in the space, and I've worked for AAPI candidates, I was chief of staff to an Indian American congressman. I ran an Asian American coalition in DC for a while. Our community has often been overlooked and underinvested in for GOTV. What I think is remarkable about Georgia is now that Georgia is a purple swing state, all the national orgs are investing in Georgia. And it's an interesting pilot or test case for what happens when you invest in API voters. Because APIs are the fastest growing population in Georgia. Everybody had to invest in Asian Americans. And it's a small state with a limited population, and APIs were a disproportionate part of that rising margin making group. So when I was down there for Stacey Abrams, and then when I was down there for Raphael Warnock, I was invited to tons of API events by our AAPI partners. Oh, can you come kick off this canvas? Can you do this? Can you do that? Much more so than I am in any other state where I was running around doing outreach on abortion. And for the first time in a very long time, our partners at API Victory, you know, AAA Fund, Aspire PAC, Indian American Impact, were polling and doing outreach and in language on abortion rights to voters in Georgia and other states. I have not seen that kind of specific voter outreach on abortion access in language in targeted communities. So I think that's a great example for 2024. Actually, it's a great example for 2023, where we have Virginia as a critical swing legislature and a very large, robust API population. We have multiple Asian Americans in the legislature now of all backgrounds, you know, Vietnamese American, Pakistani American, like many different folks, and a large population that could swing the legislature, and a state that has a governor that is hell-bent on disguising his views on abortion, but restricting abortion access and possibly banning abortion. So I would like to see the research and the work that was done in Georgia applied to other states, including by us, and seeing what we can do to use this issue to really drill down with our communities and be that difference.
And it's really interesting you brought Virginia too, because you can take abortion access in the South right now. It's really abysmal, right? And Virginia is right now acting as the safe haven, but it's under jeopardy. And we have such a large community over there. And given the data, we are supportive of reproductive freedom. So we can literally be that tipping point for Virginia. And it's so important to invest in our resources.
Yeah, women elected officials in the legislature now who can lead the way, lead the message to our communities. It's the perfect opportunity for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And now on to our last question. As a member of the AAPI community, which encompasses people of various backgrounds and beliefs, I, struggle to find a shared issue to advocate for when fighting for AA and HPI rights. Since we have so many, like such a diverse background, we don't all think the same. We're not a monolith. It's so hard to like kind of like rally behind an issue that we all care about. But given the data too, abortion access has always been a cause that resoundingly unites our diverse community. As someone who has been fighting for reproductive freedom for years, what guidance would you offer young AAPI activists like myself who are working to bring our community together to support this critical issue?
It's a great point that we're not a monolith.
Yeah.
In some ways, the AANHPI identity, and it's a mouthful, is indicative of the diversity of our communities. So,
yeah.
I started my activism in the community in college in the early 90s. And I remember those early struggles of shifting from Indian American to South Asian American. And folks saying, like, and understanding that this is a political construct in the United States. We have created a political identity related to coalition building in its purest form.
Right.
And we alone, any of our communities are not big enough, no matter how much we think we might be, to really stand alone. And so we found a common thread, which is being from the Asia Pacific Islander region and having some similar immigration stories. We were all dramatically affected by the 1965 Immigration Act, which was a result of the civil rights struggles by Black Americans. And many of us came from that route. We have limited English proficiency issues. We have cultural similarities. We have faith similarities. But you're right, the diversity is often more, and the diversity is often a challenge. And the larger our communities get, and I think the largest South Asian migration happened in the 90s.
Yeah.
Like I was already in college. So I remember pre-90s being an Indian American in this country and post-90s and it being like an explosion. In my own family, my cousins all came in the 90s. And we'd been here already like 20 years. Yeah. So I would say for young activists in our community, pick the thing that you care about the most. It doesn't matter if it connects to the broader community. Because ultimately we all find each other and we all come together. So when I started doing work in the community, for me, it was about representation.
Right.
I started by getting involved in groups that supported candidates who looked like us. Right. Under the theory that having more candidates who looked like us would give us better accessibility to public services, public information, to representation at the highest levels. And the reason, Bobby Jindal always sticks in my mind is I was a member of an Indian American political organization that used to be nonpartisan until Bobby Jindal. And then after Bobby Jindal, we split. Because that was when we realized it's not enough to support candidates who look like us. We need to support candidates who also share our values. Right. And as our friends in the Black community have told us and educated us, all skin folk aren't kinfolk. Not everybody represents the rest of us, right? So as we grow, we evolve and we become more sophisticated as communities. So I think you pick the thing that resonates the most with you. For me, it was, there's not enough Indian Americans and South Asian Americans and AAPIs on television. There's not enough in public office. There's not enough in the C-suite. I don't feel like I have a place to go. And so if I don't have a place to go, I'm going to create that.
Yeah. And I think I think the reason why I started in the AAPI movements was because same exact reason. I feel like we didn't have the seat at the table. If you don't have the seat at the table, you're on the menu then, right? So like it's really important for us to grab that political power because we are such a huge population and we're going to continue to grow. I mean, you take New York in general, like we are also one of the largest populations in New York and we're going to continue.
We're still relatively unrepresented. Like there's more AAPIs and NHPIs in representation in Virginia than in government than in New York, which is
it's so wild to me. And like we're also AAPIs in New York are also the poorest population too. So we aren't being our voices aren't being shown, and you would think like in New York we're a liberal state, but like we're very established, you know, like the New York establishment is strong here, so we need to break through and just to have more representation in our communities. And also, like, for me at least, you know, when the Dobbs decision happened, the overturn of Roe happened, it was like, for me, I felt that, oh my God, like this is an issue that will literally impact me. This is the first time where I felt that, oh my God, um, I mean, yes, I've been impacted by policies, but this is the first time that I felt that, oh my God, okay, like this is actually going to impact me very, like, personally. So if
I mean,
it's going to impact me, it's going to impact my community, you know?
Americans between 18 and 35, 40, they're the most impacted by this decision of any population in the country, whether your
Yeah.
race, this cuts across
Yep.
race, religion, geography. You can think you're in New York and you have access, but it's still under the threat of a federal national ban, which every one of these Republicans would try to pull. So
Yeah.
I think, you know, for folks who are watching and don't know, you started with SALDEF, a South
I did.
Asian Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I think it's so important that you bring that perspective here, and then you can bring our perspective back to the community. And we do need
Absolutely.
more folks who are rooted in the community to join these broader progressive movements. It's so important.
It's so, so important. And I think, you know, once we have like a rallying point, we just stick together. We have more mobility to move around within our group, and also to move around in social circles outside of our group too. So, and political circles. So I think, you know, reproductive freedom can be that issue and can be that movement that really brings us together. And I also really liked what you said, to talk about and rally behind something that you actually care about. That, I think that really resonated with me. And, you know, when I do more AAPI advocacy, I will keep that in mind. And for me, at least, reproductive freedom is something that I really do deeply care about. And I want to spread across my community and become thought leaders in the AAPI sphere. I really appreciate that advice.
I think whenever you advocate for something that personally affects you and your family, and that,
Right.
or that you are personally passionate about, you're just a better advocate. It's a
Exactly.
great way to start. You know,
Right.
you don't have to, you're the most authentic, and you're
Right.
already a subject matter expert.
Exact. That's true. That's very true.